Well, that's what today's deep dive is all about. We're going deep into the world of modern board games. And I'm talking way beyond Monopoly and Scrabble. We've been digging into some super interesting articles about this whole modern board game craze that's been going on. Plus, we've got a ton of recommendations from some serious board game enthusiasts. So today, we're going to give you some really cool alternatives to spice up your next game night. You know, the kind of games that'll make people say, wait a minute, we're not just like rolling dice here. So before we get into the actual games themselves, I'm curious, what's driving this whole modern board game thing? Why are people ditching the classics?
Well, what's really interesting is that board games have totally changed. It's not just rolling dice and moving around a board anymore. Modern board games have these really cool themes, super creative ways of playing. And the strategy involved can get crazy complicated. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, so it's not your grandma's game night anymore. I get it.
Yeah.
But for those of us who still kind of like those classic games, how do these modern games stack up? Like, what if I'm in the mood for, say, a Monopoly vibe, but without all the fighting with my family?
Well, if you're into the whole property owning thing, the resource management part of Monopoly, but you want something a little faster, a little more strategic, Ticket to Ride is a really great choice. Instead of buying properties, you collect these sets of colored train cars, and you use them to claim railway routes on a map. It's all about connecting different cities, and it can get surprisingly competitive.
See, now this is what I'm talking about. I love that it has that strategy element to it. And what about Catan? I feel like I hear about Catan everywhere. How does that compare to something like Monopoly?
Catan's like a modern classic for a reason. Like Monopoly, you've got resource management, strategic building. But here's the thing. The board is totally different every single time you play. You're actually building the game board as you play, which makes it really unpredictable. And that means you can play it over and over again. It's never the same. Plus, there's a lot of negotiating involved. Like, if you have the only wheat someone needs to build a city, let's just say you've got some leverage.
Okay, I'm starting to see why people get hooked on Catan. It sounds like the perfect mix of strategy, luck, and maybe a little friendly bargaining. But what about those people who really love strategy, like the hardcore strategists? Are there modern games for them, games that'll really make them think?
For sure. If you want a really complex, brain-bending game, Power Grid is a good one. Just imagine. You're building power plants, you're connecting cities, you're managing your resources to create this whole energy grid. It has that economic theme, but then it has this layer of tension because you're thinking about things like which energy sources to use. Do you go for the cheaper power plants, even if they pollute more? Or do you invest in cleaner, more sustainable options?
Whoa, that sounds intense. It's like Monopoly meets like a crash course in energy economics or something. I love that modern games aren't afraid to get into those more complex topics. Okay, so we talked about the strategy side of things, but what about people who love word games, but maybe they're not exactly Scrabble champions? What about them?
Well, if you want a game that's just as much about clever wordplay as it is about strategy, you've got to try Codenames. It's a team game where you give your teammates one-word clues to try to get them to guess a set of secret words. But there's a catch. There are also these assassin words that if your team guesses one, you automatically lose.
Okay, that sounds seriously challenging and hilarious. I can already picture those awkward looks when someone gives a totally terrible clue. But what if you want to keep that word-building fun of Scrabble, but you want something new, something different? What did the experts suggest for that?
Oh, our board game people, they could not stop talking about paperback. Yeah, paperback. It's got that classic, making words thing like Scrabble, but there's this whole deck building element to it. So you use these letter cards to make words. You get points, right? But you're also collecting new cards for your deck as you go. So it adds a whole other level of strategy.
Oh, that's cool. You're like building your own custom word-making deck as you play.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That sounds like a perfect game for people who love words and strategy. Speaking of strategy, we were talking about Codenames earlier, which is a team game. Are there any other modern games that are more about working together, instead of just trying to beat everyone else?
Totally. One that our sources were really into is Just One. It's a party game, right? And everyone's working together to help one person guess the secret word. Sounds kind of simple, but here's the thing. Each person can only give one word as a clue. And here's the other thing. If two people give the same clue, it's gone.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you really got to think about the absolute perfect word to get your point across without accidentally saying what someone else is going to say. That's tough. I like it. Okay, from teamwork to something completely different. Remember Connect 4. Simple game, but so satisfying. Are there any modern games that kind of capture that same feeling of, I can get 4 in a row, but, maybe a little more challenging?
Oh, for sure. If you're a Connect 4 fan, Santorini's going to blow your mind. It's got that same, like, get 4 in a row thing going on. But here's what's crazy. You're playing on a 3D board. You build these little structures as you go, and each player has these, like, god powers they can use. It can really mess with the other players.
Hold on, wait. Did you say god powers? Okay, now I'm really interested. That sounds like it adds a whole other level, a whole other dimension,
Yeah.
literally, to the strategy.
Oh, for sure it does. And speaking of games that look amazing, the experts were also huge fans of Azul. It's all about like drafting these really pretty tiles and then you arrange them on your board to make patterns. It's actually a lot more strategic than you'd think, but the real appeal is just how cool it looks while you're playing it.
I love games that look as good as they play. It seems like modern board games have really stepped it up in the looks department. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about card games. I mean, who doesn't love a good game of Uno, right? But what if you're ready to graduate from, draw 4 craziness? Yeah. What's out there?
If you like your games with a side of chaos, a little bit of, well, maybe a lot of laughter, Exploding Kittens is definitely worth checking out. It's a card game, but with a really dark sense of humor. Basically, you're just trying not to draw the exploding kitten card, and you've got all these wacky cards you can use, like to, I don't know, defuse bombs, attack other players, or even just skip your turn. It's kind of like Russian roulette, but with kittens and, a lot less dangerous.
See, this is why I love modern board games. Mm-hmm. Exploding Kittens, that's amazing. I bet that game leads to some pretty great stories. But what if you're looking for something a little, more skill-based, a little more strategic in the card game department? What did the experts say?
They were big fans of Sushi Go. It's a card drafting game, really fun. Everyone's trying to collect these sets of sushi cards. The person with the best sets at the end wins. It's got this cute theme, but don't let that fool you. There's actually a lot of strategy that goes into it, like when to keep a card, when to pass, trying to figure out what your opponents are going to do.
Sushi Go. Okay, I'm adding that to my list. It sounds like my kind of game. The perfect mix of like lighthearted fun, but still some strategic thinking. But what if we're looking for something a little more, I don't know, challenging? Maybe even a little cooperative, like we were talking about before.
Well, there's this game, The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9. It's a cooperative trick-taking game. So you use cards to, outsmart the other players, try to reach your goals, but get this. Everyone's actually working together to try to complete these missions, and they get harder and harder as you go. It's kind of like a space-themed puzzle, where you have to really communicate and plan things out to succeed.
Wait, so it's like we're all in space, there's a mystery to solve, and we have to work together to figure it out before, I don't know, we get sucked into a black hole or something. That sounds intense. Okay, we've covered a lot of awesome-sounding games today. But for someone who's just getting started with modern board games, what are some good ones to kind of dip their toes in, some like gateway games?
It's true. There are a ton of games out there. It can be a little overwhelming. Our sources recommended starting with games that are easy to pick up, but, still have some depth. Games you can play again and again, and they're still interesting. We talked about Catan, Ticket to Ride. Those are good ones. They also really liked Carcassonne. It's this tile-laying game. You basically build this medieval landscape as you go. Roads, monasteries, that kind of thing. You get points for the stuff you build. It's simple to learn, but it can get pretty competitive.
Carcassonne, yeah, that's a good one. Looks so innocent at first, all peaceful. And then next thing you know, you're like, don't you dare put your road there. That's my territory. I do love a good game that sneaks up on you like that.
Right. And for something completely different, they also mentioned King of Tokyo. It's a dice game. Super fun. Everyone plays as a giant monster, and you're all fighting to take over Tokyo. It's fast-paced, good for just a casual game night with friends.
Okay, I'm sold. Giant monsters battling for Tokyo. Sign me up.
It sounds like the kind of game that kids would love, but adults would have fun with too. It seems like we've just scratched the surface here. What do you think is so cool about this whole modern board game thing that's been happening?
I think it's amazing how these games have become more than just games, It's not just about passing the time, it's about connecting with people, like really connecting face to face, putting down the phones, the tablets, all that. It's a shared experience.
That's such a good point. You're totally right. It's a chance to unplug, laugh with your friends and family, maybe get a little competitive, but in a good way, and you're making memories while you're at it.
Exactly.
So as we wrap things up here, what's one piece of advice you'd give to our listeners who are ready to, dive into the world of modern board games? Don't be afraid to try new things. Seriously, there are so many creative, innovative games out there. Step outside your comfort zone, see what you find. Speaking of which, you mentioned earlier that tiny towns was mentioned in one of the articles. It's you're building a town, but like Tetris style. Sounds pretty cool.
Tiny towns, yeah. I think that's the perfect note to end on. We've talked about so many cool games today, but it's good to remember there's always something new to discover. Well, there you have it, everyone.